Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Just be a few minutes while we admit everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We appreciate you on a Giving Tuesday. We would love, as we're waiting to get the program started and we're admitting everyone, we had a really great turnout. We encourage you to write in the chat where you're tuning in from. Idaho, awesome. Wilton. I love seeing where people are tuning in from. Admiral Park. Yay, Saratoga. I like that you call out Northwest Saratoga Springs, Libby. Slingerlands, Latvia, Buffalo, Rochester. Great.
Oh, Bills.
We're so excited to have you. Another Wilton. Northern Utah. Great. I know it's 7:01. We had over 120 people register. We all know that sometimes it takes a little while for people to get situated, so we're just gonna wait a few more minutes. So I appreciate your patience. We don't want anybody to miss out on the great content of tonight's program. And again, if you're just joining us, we'd love to see where you're tuning in from. Please share that in the chat. Malta, Boston, nice. Ohio. I'm originally from Ohio, Kent, Ohio. Okay. Churchill Historic District. I like that you call out a historic district. That's great. Is that Nicole? Our Nicole? Is that our Nicole who's joining us or no? You're a different Nicole. Kristi and Marco getting some love. Well, just gonna give it like 1 or 2 more minutes. People are still joining us. I appreciate your patience. Again, anybody who wants to share where they're tuning in from, we appreciate that. Again, we appreciate you tuning in on a Tuesday night, on Giving Tuesday, and supporting our organization with a donation. All right. Well, I think we will. Oh, San Diego. Nice. So I think we will get started. I'm sure others will be joining us. I'm Samantha Bosshart, the Executive Director of the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation, and we are thrilled to be able to host this program tonight as part of our Giving Tuesday. We know there's a lot of organizations that are promoting Giving Tuesday today, and we appreciate that you're willing to spend your time with us tonight so that we can share about Chestwood, which is just a stunning property out on Grand Avenue that unless you are familiar with it, you would maybe not even know it exists in Saratoga Springs. So before we get too far, I just want to share who we are, as some of you may not be familiar with us. The Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation was founded in 1977 to promote the preservation and enhancement of the architectural and cultural landscaped heritage of Saratoga Springs. And we do that through advocacy, technical assistance, education, and restoration. Some of you, the projects that you may be familiar with, most recent is our 65 Philo Street project, the restoration of that long neglected building. Also another project would be the Spirit of Life restoration in Congress Park. But, we also do walking tours every Sunday, pretty much from early June through the end of October. So if you have not had an opportunity to do that, there are different neighborhoods. So I encourage you to come on one of our tours. And we do that also through other educational programs, such as what we're doing tonight. And we are a member-based organization. And so but we have some exciting news, and that is that we have bought another property to restore. This is the two cottages, 128 and 130 Clinton Street. Many of you may recognize them from across from Eddie F's or perhaps the former Pink store on Clinton Street. They've been on our watch list for more than a decade. The building, the two buildings were built roughly between 1877 and 1882. And one of them is the only, yay, Clinton Street comeback. The one at 130, on the left of the screen is the only shotgun that we're aware of in Saratoga Springs. And the other one is a great example of a vernacular cottage. These buildings were going to be lost to redevelopment, and we were fortunate enough to be able to secure financing to purchase them. So stay tuned for the Clinton Street comeback, and I hope you will support us as we, preserve what we call, this is West Side worker housing, and these buildings are not in a historic district and they're not protected. So I hope you will join us as we move through this. And of course, please feel free to, make another donation, or you'll probably be solicited for one in the semi-near future. But we just wanted to have you guys be the first to know about this new purchase. So with that, I'm excited to introduce, I guess I should say, we are a membership-based organization. And it's our memberships start at $35. Our family memberships are $75. That comes with advance notice, discounts, and to such events as our historic homes tour that takes place in May. So I just would, you know, your voice matters, and the more members that we have, the stronger our voice is for preserving our really amazing city. So I thank all of our existing members and donors and volunteers who help us do the work that we do, but we would love for our tent to get bigger. So I hope you will join us. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Carol Godette, who is going to give the introduction for today's program. Carol Godette has done many of our Giving Tuesday programs, and she's won an award for her articles and her work in preserving the history of our area. And she is a regular contributor, like I am, to Simply Saratoga. So I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to Carol to share about this amazing property and about Kristi and Marco, who have taken on an amazing project. And let's hear more.
Good evening. I'm thrilled to introduce Kristi and Marco. And I met Kristi last spring when I was doing a preservation program at 69 Caroline Street. And I saw her in the very front row of the audience. And I was curious why she was there. So after the program, I asked her, what drew you to this program? And she said, well, actually, I heard from our city historian that you knew the Sweeneys. And they were very close friends of the first people who ever lived in the house we live in, the Slades. And I'm trying to track down some of the 5,000 books that the Sweeneys got from them. And I knew the minute she started telling me her story, I had found a kindred spirit. And I knew, like Sam, who's always writing, thinking of ideas for a story for Simply Saratoga, that this would be my next story. So I set up a time, and Kristi and Marco invited me out to come to their house. And I love this slide that we're looking at now of them. And that's how they were welcoming me in. And they said, well, we can give you about 2 hours. And I never spend that long interviewing anyone. The 2 hours flew by. It was fascinating. And I said, I need everyone else who's interested in preservation, or the two families who once lived in this house. I knew the Snyder family well, and also before that, the Slades, to have the same experience and opportunity I had. So I pitched the idea to Sam, who loved it, and here we are tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristi and Marco, and you are in for a treat.
Thank you so much, Carol and Sam. And I think, Carol, you're so right that I think this old house has really brought us to find a lot of kindred spirits, which is really special as well. I think just the people we've met through it too. Well, I'm Kristi Krulcik, and this is my husband, Marco Anichini, and we're thrilled to talk about Chestwood as we begin celebrating its sesquicentennial, so it's 150th anniversary, and we're tuning in live from the Chestwood Library. You'll hear in a little bit why the library is such a, I guess, important symbol of the house as well. And then later you'll hear from Carol Snyder Valdez, who grew up here and spent pretty much her entire childhood here as well, and many years with her family. So you'll have two residents that you're hearing, or two sets of residents that you're hearing from today. Great. So I'm a Saratoga Springs native. I didn't grow up in an old house, but I always loved walking around the many Victorian houses that we're lucky to have here in Saratoga.
I spent the early part of my childhood in another very similar historic spa town south of Munich, just north of the Austrian border, before we then immigrated to Cherry Valley, New York, which isn't all too far from Saratoga Springs, just down Route 20. We've always been passionate about family history, antiques, anything old. I was antiquing with a good family friend of ours at a very young age. And when Kristi and I met, we quickly hit it off. And looking back, definitely realized that it's something that connected us. I don't think we knew that we would end up on this path, but looking back, it does make sense.
Definitely. And we figured what better way to introduce you to Chestwood than to talk about how we were first introduced to it. So back in June 2020, it was COVID. I was back visiting my parents in Saratoga, and that was right around the time when Chestwood came up for sale. And at the time, I was not looking, Marco and I were not looking to move back to Saratoga, but I was immediately mesmerized by this house because even though I grew up in Saratoga, I grew up on the other side of town and had never before seen this house. It's out, as we'll show in a little bit, on its own on a residential road. So if you don't really go down that residential road, it's outside of town, one of really the only Victorian houses that's outside of town and on some land. So I basically wondered, what is the story behind this house? How have I never heard of it or seen it before? And it was very intriguing from day one. And as the months went on, the house kept serendipitously popping up in our lives. And at the same time, we unfortunately had some family health issues that brought us back to Saratoga and realized that it probably made sense to move back. So we took our first tour of the house. And just like Marco said, we've both always been into learning about the history of things, especially family history, and just, what is the story behind a place? And so the very next day after we first saw the house, we went to the Saratoga room at the local library to see if there was any information that we could find out. And the Saratoga room was closed, but they did have a shelf full of binders where you could look at things yourself. And thanks to the Preservation Foundation, we knew that on the house was a plaque that said Residence of Charles Slade. And we had taken a picture of it, so we at least knew a name. And were able to look up Slade in those binders, and we found the most wonderful article that kind of changed everything for us. So this article was by Martha Stonequist. Martha might even be on this call tonight tuning in. She was the city historian before the current city historian, Mary Ann Fitzgerald. And Martha had written this article in the late 80s. And it was basically told from her childhood perspective of how magical it was to go to Chestwood and visit her godparents, which were John and Caroline Slade. It was because of this article that we learned that the house had a name, and we had thought it seemed magnificent enough to deserve a name. So we just loved the name Chestwood as well. And she really also truly brought to life what the house was like and what the people were like that lived there and just how inspiring they were. So we pulled out a couple of favorite quotes, but she talks about how it was the fulfillment of any child's dream. But on the right-hand side, I'm going to quickly read how she ended the article. So she wrote, "For those of us who knew the joy of John and Caroline Slade's friendship, who marveled at their devotion to each other, who experienced their warmth, their minds, their humor, and their goodness, John and Caroline Slade and Chestwood will never leave us, but live in us for the rest of our lives." So a big thank you to Martha for, I think, really turning our lives around with this wonderful article.
So here's just a quick summary of what we'll cover. We'll talk about the house. What else? The architect, the past residents. Carol will speak a little bit about the time her family spent here. Some of our preservation efforts, and then we'll finish it up with a Q&A, and hopefully some of you will have some memories of Chestwood, maybe even of the Slades, that we can share at the end. Feel free while we're doing the presentation here to put your questions in the chat. We'll handle that all at the end. So let's get started. If you're not from Saratoga, you might not know where we're even talking about, but maybe you're from Saratoga and you still don't know where it is. Chestwood is out pretty far on the west side of Saratoga Springs. It originally was built as a farm. So this part of Saratoga Springs was a Grand Avenue extension. It was far out. It was the countryside. It's 1.8 miles from Congress Park, straight down Grand Avenue. Now, some people may know it as a farm. Holly Grandy, who may be in the chat with us here, her late husband, Bill Grandy, largely developed this area for affordable housing, and he always referred to it as a farm, which today, when you drive by the house, you might not make that connection. So we're fortunate today to still have 6 of the original 36 acres left, along with 2 barns. On the west side of the property, we border Slade Creek, also named after the Slade family. And here you can see some photos from the Snyders showing you what Slade Creek was or is, especially what this beautiful old stone bridge was. This is no longer here. Decades ago, Grand Avenue was straightened and the beautiful bridge was removed. But many of you might know Slade Creek for what it used to be, which was, from what we've heard, the swimming hole for the west side of Saratoga.
Great. And Chestwood was built originally in 1874 into 1875, like Marco said, on 36 acres. It was designed by G.B. Croff, and we'll go into all the details on these bullet points later, in the Second Empire style. And as you may have picked up on, there were only 3 families, or have only been 3 families to live here in 150 years, which is really a special and remarkable part of the history. And I think one reason why we've been able to feel so connected to it as well, because we've known exactly who's lived here. The house apparently got its name because of all of the chestnut trees that used to be around here. And it's just under 2 miles from Broadway. So like Marco said, if you go from Congress Park and just keep going down Congress, it turns into Grand Ave, and keep following it almost 2 miles, and there we are. And something that has always been very interesting to us is the house has had many addresses, but this envelope here is from the author John Cheever. He was a good friend of the Slades, and he sent this letter from Ossining, New York. And you can see here that he wrote Mrs. John Slade, Chestwood, Saratoga Springs, New York. So even as recent as 1964, the address Chestwood was still sufficient, which is really interesting. But the house is often just far enough, it's just past the train tracks, that it's often not on a lot of the old maps. So we mentioned the Second Empire style. So let's talk a bit about what that is. So the most signature feature of the Second Empire style is the mansard roof. It was originally created, or I should take a step back for a second. The Second Empire style was popular for about 20 years, from about the 1850s to through the 1870s, but most commonly, and for the most part, most Second Empire structures were built in the late 1860s and then throughout the 1870s. So it's a relatively short-lived style, which makes it somewhat rare to an extent as well. But it was inspired by the architecture in France, especially in Paris, because at the time, Napoleon III did a huge transformation of Paris into what it is today. So you might recognize these unique roof lines. And the Second Empire style was not really building on classical Greek and Gothic traditions like a lot of other styles were. It was really leaning into this new and emerging fashion. And so again, like I was saying, the mansard roof is kind of the most quintessential feature of the Second Empire home. And it really was a creative solution to allow for more living space on the 3rd floor, essentially by making the roof lines very tall and steep. It allows for full height ceilings on the top floor as well. And the next thing is a tower. So just like Chestwood, they're usually square or rectangular. They might be symmetrical and right in the center of the structure, or they might be off to the side like ours is. And because the Second Empire style came after the Italianate period, or the Italianate style, it still shares a lot of its features. So for example, it has bay windows, it has decorative brackets under overhanging eaves, ornate hoods over the windows and doors. And it also has pairs of doors and windows together as well. And in terms of the fate of the Second Empire style and kind of how it's evolved over time, the first thing is that in 1873, there was the Panic of 1873. So the prosperity that the country saw after the Civil War quickly turned into a depression a few years later. And so these grand structures became a little bit less popular. And at the same time, Napoleon III ended his reign. So his building style there was becoming less popular. And in terms of how you see these houses today, they're often known as the haunted houses in many shows and movies. And when you look into why that is, it seems that it's mainly because all of these houses were built in a relatively short period of time, which means that they all kind of went into disrepair around the same time if they weren't maintained. And so around that time, they started to be featured in, for example, Edward Hopper's House by the Railroad painting in 1925, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and also the Addams Family, you know, all of these different shows and paintings and that kind of thing that started to feature them helped to solidify their position as the haunted house. And I guess also their very grand and ornate style. We always like that the house, we always think it's funny that the house is on Grand Ave because grand seems to be a very appropriate word for it. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Saratoga Springs in 1874, the year that Chestwood was, I almost said was born, was created. The 1874 was such a significant year in Saratoga that there are often articles written about it, tours given about it. It was the only year where all 4 of the Grand Hotels, which were some of the biggest in the world at the time, were in existence. And that gives you a sense of Saratoga during that time, how prominent it was and its prosperity. But what you can also notice in these photos is that all of these hotels were either built or renovated in the late 1860s, early 1870s. So they all have the quintessential mansard roof as well. And unfortunately, none of these, which is one of the saddest things, still exists today, but at least we have these beautiful photos. Great.
Okay, so how did we determine the architect of Chestwood? I mean, where do you even begin with a search like this? When we purchased the house, we didn't know the name, we didn't know the architect. We really knew very little aside from Martha Stonequist's article about the history of the house. So if you recall, we moved in March of 2021. So in April, 1 month later, just 1 month later, we came across this book that you see here, Progressive American Architecture. Progressive American Architecture was a book that was published by G.B. Croff in 1875. And the plate in the book that really struck us was plate 53. There was something about this plate that was so closely resembled Chestwood. Of course, there are architectural details that are different, but this style, this asymmetric style, you know, remove the porch, you see so many similarities between the two houses. So our burning question at this point really was: is it a G.B. Croff? Is this Chestwood? Was this maybe Chestwood, just the full detail was never actually realized? So on the exterior, we saw many similarities, but we had even more clues. We're so lucky to have the original floor plans and porch elevation drawings, but they aren't signed. Those were left to us by the Snyders, the previous residents, which we're so thankful for, because they really give us clues into not only how people lived in the house, but also this burning question that we had. You know, who was the architect? So plate 54, the following plate in the book, Croff provides floor plans. He provides the first floor. So comparing that to the floor plans that we have, we found that they were almost identical. There were 2 rooms, the kitchen and the dining room, that were switched, but the dimensions were the same. Everything fit. So we just kept getting pulled in. And this is where you start to see where we can really go down these rabbit holes of research, of trying to find answers. So after searching and searching, we finally confirmed that Croff indeed was the architect. On March 5th, 1874, the Saratoga Sentinel very briefly, very succinctly mentions two very tasty looking residences being planned by G.B. Croff for that season, for erection that season. Now, his designs, from what I found, were quite frequently described as tasty looking. For us, it's something we laugh about a lot because it's such an endearing way of describing them. So the two residences that were designed were the Charles G. Slade residence, Chestwood, and the G.W. Hopkins residence on Union Avenue. You may recognize it if you're a Saratogian. It's the image on the left here. Today, it's the Springwater Inn and Brook Tavern. If you compare them, again, they are very similar. Clearly, the residence has lost some of the architectural features. Some things have been changed. But I mean, from here, you could ask, is there really any way that you can go deeper? Like you kind of have the conclusion here, right? Well, we did. We always somehow find a way to go deeper. After months of research, we tracked down a relative of the Slades, and he shared this 1885 photo of Chestwood with us. The house was only about 10 years old, and you can imagine that it left us speechless. In the photo, if you look close, you can see the Slade family, and off to the right, there's little John Slade, who's being held by his father. He was born in the house, and he would live in the house the rest of his 87 years of life. So look at this photo really closely one more time. The next slide, I'm going to show you what Chestwood looks like today. We would love for you to put in the chat some of the differences that you see between this and what Chestwood looks like today. So here we have Chestwood now. And what you might notice is that let's see, are we getting, looks like we have some, there's no fence yet. Yeah, so that's and the wraparound porch. Okay, there we go. You're hitting the big ones. So yeah, the
There's
chimney.
one more big one, the biggest one.
Yeah, there's one more big one. The ones that you've mentioned. So the porch, we know from the photo, from the 1885 photo, was added later. We don't know when. It was definitely added more than 11 years after the construction of the house, so after 1885. And you got the big one, the carriage house, right? The carriage house was moved down the street during the Great Depression for John's wife, Caroline, for her brother to live in. The fence, which I think you also got here. If we go one more slide, you'll really catch the fence here again, with a wooden fence, just beautifully made. Also, many of the details documented in progressive American architecture. You'll see here on this slide some more of these plates in G.B. Croft's book. The fence, we believe, or at least it appears, that the pickets were eventually reused as the lattice on the back porch. So the front porch was not on the original floor plans. Neither was the back porch. So this may have been a likely way to reuse material. So let's see, here we go. So the conclusion that we have come to is that both of these houses very clearly so closely resemble the plans in the pattern book. They were designed in the same year by the same architect. So there's a good chance that this is a combination of the two residences. This is really a great example of the intention of a pattern book like Progressive American Architecture as an advertisement, a portfolio, not uncommon for the period, for G.B. Croff to make his work well known, to grow his business. So we find ourselves drawn down these rabbit holes because it doesn't end. You just keep going. There's surprisingly very little information available on G.B. Croff. So recently, that's where we've been going, further down that rabbit hole. Who was G.B. Croff? G.B. Croff, from the research we've done, was born in Wallingford, Vermont in 1841. He died in New York City in 1909. He had offices in both Saratoga Springs and New York City. He worked up and down the eastern seaboard, all the way up to Montreal. He was married and had one daughter who sadly died at a very young age in 1875, the year that Progressive American Architecture was published. He did go to St. John, New Brunswick, Canada for a few years in the late 1870s after a great fire and helped to rebuild that city. In this time, he seemed to be partnering with Frederick Theodore Camp under the name of Croff and Camp, also really designing structures in the Second Empire style. Now, Croff, as a person, Croff, because there's so little information out there, we use newspapers, any resources we can to try to understand who he is, what he was doing at the time period. The three books, the three publications that he had were Model Suburban Architecture in 1870, which you see here on the left. This one is a pretty hard find. Progressive American Architecture does seem to be more widely known. The second one was much more of a pamphlet than it was a book, Original Designs for Front Entrance Doors. So perhaps when you're walking down the streets of Saratoga in the next weeks, you'll notice some of the beautiful doors that we have and think about, some of these might be Croff doors. And then finally, Progressive American Architecture. Progressive American Architecture was, we believe, really influenced by his travels. His passport application in 1873 indicated that he intended to visit England, Ireland, Scotland, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Italy, Greece, Egypt, France, and Spain, traveling Europe and the Middle East, which I think if you look at the book, you see that influence, especially that influence in the Second Empire style, probably from his time in Paris.
And I just realized people can actually now go on Amazon and get a very cheap large paperback of his book. Just in the last year, someone made it available. So if you want to check it out, go ahead.
Yeah. So G.B. Croff, it's clear by his writings that he was very philosophical. On December 13th, 1877, the Saratogian mentions that architect G.B. Croff, who is now at St. John, New Brunswick, is about to deliver a lecture there on imagination. We especially love some of these quotes by him, whether they're from his books or clippings from the newspaper. But listen to these. I mean, homes, lasting and beautiful monuments that shall leave on every beholder an indelible impression that shall bloom and bring forth fruit again. Dearest of all places on earth to the human heart, a beautiful home around which hope and memory delight ever to linger. So this was a really unique man. Today, we do have some Croff structures left, aside from the many residences that he built. The ones that you'll probably know the most are here on Broadway, the Ainsworth Block, as it was called, where Menges and Curtis, the pharmacy, has been for ages. As well as the Civil War monument in Congress Park, which was restored not too long ago. The base of that was designed by Croff. So I'm sure you can tell, I could talk about Croff nonstop. We could keep this going, but there's so much to cover. So we'll keep going here. Kristi will speak
Yes.
a little bit about some of the first residents.
And I was just thinking it could be interesting if anyone has heard of Croff before in the chat. That would be fun to hear. What we've found is that he was extremely prolific, but just like Marco said, he didn't sign his floor plans, and he's very well known for the Second Empire style. But unfortunately, his name has somewhat been lost to history.
Similar
like
to the house.
Yeah, like the Slades, as well, as we're about to talk about. And I think that that's what's really maybe especially driven us too, is finding out these amazing stories and fun facts, and just wanting so badly to share them and keep preserving them as well. Great, so I'm going to move into the residence now. As we talked about, the Slade family was here for almost a century, and the Snyders were here for half a century. So truly all left a lasting impact on the house, but also on the community and at the state level, pretty much all of them actually. On the right here is a photo of just some of the many photos, scrapbooks, books, and materials we've been able to track down since moving in, and we're so thankful for everyone, especially if you're on this call today, for helping us find these things, for being very generous as well, and just offering your time, your stories, and your memories too. So Charles G. and Jenny Slade, here they are when they were young. They were both born in Rensselaer County, and as we understand it, they got married on October 27th, 1874, and moved in that day as well, before the house was quite finished. And Charles bought the land that Chestwood sits on from his father. There's actually a house across the street from us that's actually 30 to 40 years older than our house. They just recently got a plaque and a house history from the Preservation Foundation. We're really excited to learn more. But Charles basically started out as a farmer, as Marco said, and as he was courting Jenny, the story goes that he would ride his horse to see Jenny, and he would pass many bridges some bridges that were being constructed with blue limestone. And he started to think to himself, well, I think that I have a lot of that stone on my property, and actually the very non-fertile part of his farmland. I believe he and his brother, I think, split the land. His brother took the much better farmland. So after some time, Charles decided to open what was known as the Slade Quarry. You can see a real albumin photograph of it on the right. A fun thing is that this charcoal portrait of Charles on the left was actually found in the attic, or I should say the garret under the mansard roof in Chestwood. And then the albumin on the right was something that we found in an antique shop in Cohoes. And then the Snyders very generously gifted us a copy as well. And we worked with Kettlewell and Edwards to have them framed once we found some of these write-ups, which we'll share with you too. So the Slade Quarry is out to the west here. So you see Chestwood on the left, and further down Grand Ave is Slade Road. So you can tell where that name came from. And Slade Road connects Grand Ave and Washington Street. So at the intersection of Washington Street and Slade Road is the former Slade Quarry. It's now where Paletti Stone roughly is as well. And Charles Slade's stone became very well known in Saratoga and across the state. He and his wife, we found in an article that they were most proud of how the Yaddo mansion was constructed with their stone, which is always a special thing for those of you that know of Yaddo. We'll talk about Yaddo more later in the presentation, but Yaddo is essentially what started out as a mansion on a grand, beautiful estate and later became a very famous creative retreat. And that's what it's been for the last 100 years. Charles's stone was also used to build Bethesda Church. And Saratoga was growing rapidly, as we talked about at the last quarter of the 19th century. So many of the foundations of the buildings in Saratoga also have Slade limestone, like the Armory. And you can see here too that the New York State Museum said in 1888 that Slade's stone was very well regarded and also used for the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company. Moving on to Jenny Slade. She was a dressmaker before she got married. And on the right here are two very special discoveries that we found in the house. So I'd say about 6 months after moving into the house, we were going through a box of mismatched silverware that was there. And we were so excited to find 5 matching silver forks that had engraved in the base J.A. Slauson, which is Jenny, those are Jenny's initials and her maiden name. And then on the right, you see 4 napkin rings, and 2 of them have Charlie and Jenny engraved in them, and they are reminiscent of the aesthetic movement style at the time. So as you can imagine, we were just blown away and thought it was so special that 150 years later, these were still in the house. Jenny and this is her and her daughter-in-law, Caroline. They were very close. We found in the newspaper several mentions of Jenny. She seemed to be very loved by the community. She loved her house. And we loved this photo that we just found this weekend. That's Jenny and the Women's Progressive Club that she co-founded before women had the right to vote. And that was kind of a common theme throughout Chestwood's history, is this progressive legacy that pretty much all of its residents have left behind. Moving on to John and Caroline. So we chose to be in the library today. You might recognize this photo, especially because it feels so, so core to what Chestwood is. John and Caroline have lived here, or did live here the longest. As Marco mentioned, John lived here his entire 87 years. And he and Caroline got married on the same day that John's parents did, October 27th, but in 1906. They lived here until John died in 1969, and Caroline sold the house a year later in 1970. But to give you a sense of what John and Caroline are like, they both gave so much back to the community. They had 8,000 books in their house. They had shelves apparently on every wall, stacks of books in every room. John had apparently read pretty much all of the books. And you can tell even by the books that are left that they read about sociology, psychology, every religion, every political system. They were very, very informed and kind of loved to read and to learn clearly. And I guess we love to learn, which is why we love digging into these stories. But basically their social circle consisted of very well-known poets, composers, lawyers, authors, academics as well. They got a Christmas card from Langston Hughes, for example, and I'll get to why that was pretty soon. And together they founded the first casework system in Saratoga County. So they essentially helped set up the social work system in Saratoga. And while they advocated for women and children at the local and state level, they actually did not have children themselves. So they really dedicated their lives to the community. Quick plug, if you happen to be in a used bookstore, take a look inside any older books and let us know if you find any that are labeled Slade, J.A. Slade, Carrie Slade, Caroline Slade, Chestwood, that those all count. We're fortunate to have 500 left in the library, and we've already found 2 in the wild at Lyrical Ballad. They were the first books we picked up on 2 different visits, which felt very special. And then we also had a book that found us through the internet as well. So all of them have actually led to really neat discoveries, especially the one that found us too. And John Slade, so I'm going to go back to Martha Stonequist's article in The Way Beginning, because I think she really captures the Slades so well. So on the right here, she wrote, John, so quiet and calm in his movements, always kind, never abrupt. And as you can see here, he was known as Mr. Saratoga and the first gentleman of Saratoga. I feel like Martha's description of him helps you see why he might have been the first gentleman of Saratoga. He was the city attorney and practiced law for 62 years, and he was on the Saratoga County Bar Association, or part of that as well. Every day, or supposedly pretty much every day, he would walk the almost 2 miles to Broadway to his office, smoking a pipe along the way. And apparently that's how he stayed fit into his older years. Now here's where the Yaddo part gets very exciting. John was seemingly one of the original, or almost, if not for the original board, very soon after it started for Yaddo about 100 years ago. And he was on the board for about its first 40 to 45 years, and he was president for much of that time as well. So he really helped shape Yaddo in a lot of ways, really advocated for it in many ways. But that's also why they had such unique friends as well. They were, as I mentioned, Langston Hughes, John Cheever, Carson McCullers, Sergei Kusevitsky, who it founded the Tanglewood Festival that many locals might know. He rented their carriage house that they had moved for several summers. And really had some exciting things. And one thing we wanted to show you was, we know from the one book that found us and from just a few different books that we found over the years that the Slades, well, I guess the books in the library, they liked to use their books as files as well. So one thing we like to do, because we haven't done this for every book yet, we kind of keep it as a fun activity, is if you open each book, you might find photographs, postcards, letters, a poem they wrote, notes that they took. It's really always a special discovery. And the only one left that we have, that was here when we moved in, that we found so far, with someone who's somewhat famous, is this one, The Wapshot Scandal by John Cheever. It's kind of hard to see. But basically what it has in it, I'll just show you quickly in the beginning, is that envelope that I mentioned earlier. Might be a little too bright, but it's basically a letter that John Cheever wrote to Caroline. She had attached it to the book. And then inside as well are all of these clippings. So when John Cheever was on the cover of Time magazine, words that he wrote up about how John Slade helped advocate for Yaddo and they put in the highway are right around Yaddo for locals that know about that. So Times John Cheever was featured in different publications. So it's really just fun to see that this is just one example. So you can only imagine how many treasures they tucked away there too. John was also labeled kind of the lifetime president of the Saratoga Historical Society because he was president for 28 years. Carol Godette in the start of this presentation mentioned the Sweeney family, and John and Caroline were very close with Michael and B. Sweeney. When John stepped down from being the president after 28 years, I believe he passed the baton to Michael Sweeney, and I think maybe B. Sweeney held that title at some point as well. But B. Sweeney was very instrumental in starting the preservation movement as well. And finally, John was part of the board of trustees for Skidmore College for over 20 years and also helped lead the draft board too. So he was a pacifist, but he really also made, I guess the favorite story that people have with him is that he would make sure that he was at the train station anytime somebody was drafted to know that they cared for him. And with that, we're going to, oh, wait, I have Caroline real quick. Okay, a couple more quick things. We were able to find a journal under the stairwell that John had written, and through that, we're able to find a lot of really wonderful pieces of information about the Slades and about Chestwood. He basically left behind great stories. And we'll just quickly go to Caroline as well. Martha Stonequist wrote another write-up here. Carrie, always in motion, even when still, perched on the edge of her chair, listening avidly to our talk, looking at and through us as if trying to read our innermost thoughts. I remember her quick laughter and ability to laugh at her foibles. So Caroline was the first executive secretary and investigator of the Board of Child Welfare of Saratoga County. She was a member of the League of Women Voters soon after the women had the right to vote and was part of the Business and Professional Women's Club. She wrote for Independent Woman magazine, The New Yorker, and several other publications. She wrote about everything from social work to meatless meals during World War II to renting out Chestwood. There are two articles in the New Yorker about the adventures there. And she retired early in order to write 6 fictional novels about the realities of poverty and the welfare system and really the failure of it to help sometimes the people who needed it most. And her books, eventually, many of them were translated to other languages as well. And she was often compared to John Steinbeck. So very inspiring family as well. And to wrap up the Slades before we pass it to the Snyders, one final discovery here was that we were ripping up some old carpet that was in the basement, and we found John and Caroline's initials, their handprints, and their footprints from 1956. They would have been 70 and 74. So we think that's really fun to imagine them in their 70s doing this fun thing. You'll notice in the middle there that also in our basement, there are several utilities that are labeled Ames, and that's because their best friend was Elizabeth Ames, who was the first executive director at Yaddo. For many years, they were the closest friends for decades, and they had actually renovated the second floor of Chestwood to be Upper Chestwood just for Elizabeth. Unfortunately, when they were all close to the end of their lives, they had a major falling out after a lifetime of friendship, but there are still some memories that remain. And with that, we will pass it to Carol to talk about the Snyders.
Thanks so much, Kristi. It's amazing to hear all the stories and so many commonalities between the families, right? Because the spirit of the house called us, right? Has called us to it. So yeah, I never knew that Carolyn and I shared more in common than just Chestwood, because she was a Carrie, I am a Carrie, known by friends and family. She's also a fellow Libra. Our birthdays are in October, just 9 days apart. So those kind of fun things are always incredible to hear. So yeah, of the 150 years, the Snyders were there for 50 of them. This here shows the main staircase, which was always charming to me and to many others. And I think my mom saw it as a place. She had a vision for what was going to happen in that stairway. So we moved into Chestwood in the summer of 1971. I was not quite 4 years old. And so the following summer, she had us all sit for these charcoal portraits. And then those portraits adorned that wall for all the years that we lived there. They went sequentially from oldest to youngest, except for at one point, my brother Dan and I were switched because I was too exposed to the sunlight. So I was switched to try to save mine. So we all have our own portraits. And at one point, my mom had one done as well. So those were done out on Cape Cod. All right. So yeah, what we loved and continue to love about Chestwood are obviously its history, which Kristi and Marco have so elegantly told the tale of, and of course its charm. It's what keeps us all interested and keeps it alive, and then its spirit, and most importantly, its lasting legacy. And I really think that my dad would probably have loved to have been the one to tell this story, and here talking about Chestwood. So I did the next best thing and tried to pull in some stories from him as if he were here. In 2020, I got him a subscription to Storyworth. If I don't know if folks on the call are familiar with Storyworth, so it gives prompts and allows people to tell stories. So my dad was a terse communicator, so it's really fun for me to read through it. And so here he has what are his favorite possessions and why. He couldn't, not say that his family came first, but we know that Chestwood was really his most prized possession, and he was overjoyed to be able to pass it on to Kristi and Marco to continue the love and have it be their most favorite possession. So yeah, so then we can go into, first of all, Chestwood's charm. So certainly through the years, Chestwood's charm has inspired many, including artists. These are just a few works that were done. What I love about these three is that each is from a different view. So on the far left, we have the east, sort of a corner view. This was a friend of mine who's an artist in Seattle, and he showed up one time at the end of the time that my parents were living there, and just started painting in the front yard. He made the trip from Seattle to Saratoga to paint it, which is kind of amazing. And yeah, so I think the one in the middle was done by a friend of the family, and the one to the right maybe as well. My sister Kath is on the call, and I think my sister Mary as well. So if either of you have details on the other two pieces, would be great to share it in the chat. Also, its charm attracted many admirers. I know, like Kristi said, it's might be that you never saw this house. As you can see in this not so flattering picture, that it was obscured by some giant Norwegian pines. So maybe that hit it, but it didn't stop the Preservation Foundation from including it in their tour, which was so popular that at one point there were so many people on the staircase that my mom was sure that the staircase was going to collapse and that everything would be ruined. Luckily, that did not happen, and we made it through. That was 34 years ago. All right, so Chestwood's spirit, more than anything, inspired celebration. So the house was just always an inviting space that just attracted people and parties. This picture here was the first of two weddings that were hosted at Chestwood in the time that we lived there. My sister Kathy, who's on the Zoom, this was in September of 1984, and that's in the just west of the barn. So looking the embankment at where you see the light at the end goes down to Slade Creek. And Kath in her beautiful gown, that is her on the front porch when it was screened in prior to the 1996 renovation. So beautiful day. The second of the weddings was my brother Dan's, which happened just 4 days after 9/11 on September 15th, 2001. So amazingly, we all managed to make it to that wedding. And like I said, Chestwood put its charms on display for all to celebrate. Also, it invited many a Victorian Christmas. So here is a photo that that we, not me, I was too young, but my siblings were clever enough to find a variety of garb that Victorian garb that came with the house when my parents bought it in 1971. And so they had the idea that we were going to all dress up in these clothes and create a portrait in a sepia tone for my parents to surprise my parents. So then as you can imagine, Harry and Helen were enamored with it and then used it for their Christmas card that year. And here's a note from my mom, well, mom and dad, but in my mom's handwriting, talking about giving updates on all of us, which was common for her. Moving along, I just wanted to share some evidence of the variety of celebration that happened at Chestwood. It was always a full house and plenty of space for all to celebrate. And stockings hung by the chimney with care, and there was a red carpeting throughout the whole house, which made it even more festive during the holiday season. And there was, this has two elements in it that I think still remain. The wallpaper in the dining room here on the left, which I begged, probably me and my siblings begged my mom not to change because it was, we were so fond of it. And then on the far right is Phil, which I call my fifth brother, because Phil lived with us through the years, and Phil lived in the library, in the closet of the library where Kristi and Marco are now. And he was there for years to house our all of our beverages, as well as the giant turkeys that came at Christmas and Thanksgiving. It was also the place of my first memory, one of my first memories from Chestwood as a young girl. It was a perfect spot to hide for hide and seek. And so I snuck into that closet and remember cutting my leg on something on the floor. So I was quite upset by that. But the secret part about that closet is that it cuts through to the closet that goes under the stiff front stairs. So it was always like a magical little spot as a kid. Here are that's me and my brother Kevin and Dan, who are no longer with us, and my brother Jim here, and me with crazy 80s hair. And then one last picture to highlight some of the animals and multiple generations that live there. The animals, our cat Willie came with us from our old house when we moved there in 71, the summer of 71. He tagged along, and here he is at the kitchen table at Chestwood, eating up breakfast cereal left over from one of the kids. And here's Fletch, who you saw earlier in Slade Creek, and grandkids next to the barn, my sister Mare. All right, and the last thing about Chestwood that we love is its lasting legacy, which really have inspired all the restorations that have been done through the years. This was a later discovery that my dad, Harry, sent along to all of us about 12 years ago or 11 years ago. This is an excerpt from John Slade's will, which states that, to summarize that, that if John were to outlive Caroline, then he he would basically, Chestwood would have, and then he died, he would have Chestwood knocked down. So it would not exist any longer. So here's what my dad had said, like, if Caroline had died before John, there would have been no Chestwood for us all to grow up in. So I kind of, we all hang on to the story as being, you know, just a testament to the fortitude that Chestwood has to continue on. And one more tale from my dad, from Storyworth as well. What's the longest project you have ever worked on? And so he says, the acquisition, restoration, maintenance, and upkeep of Chestwood, which took the 50 years that they lived there. It was always a passion for both mom and dad. We thought they went deep. Kristi and Marco, you went even deeper. so which is wonderful, wonderful stuff. And through the years, my brother Dan, who was a contractor, he fell for Chestwood hard early on and was part of all the renovation through the years, and really kept my parents in the game and made all of the upkeep much more approachable. All right. And so, yeah, my brother Dan was instrumental in the 1996 renovation where Chestwood became a painted lady. So I don't think my mom even knew what that term was when she decided she wanted color. But the painted lady, I know, was a kind of name popularized in the 60s when 3 or more colors were used to enhance the architectural details. The authors, Elizabeth Pomada and Michael Larson, had a book called Painted Ladies about the San Francisco's resplendent Victorians. I guess polychrome decoration was common in the Victorian era, but not used in quite the same way as it was. So yeah, so as part of this restoration, they did find a lot of work that was needed that wasn't really identified. So there was, with that much wood, you can imagine there was a lot of rot and carpenter ants, and ultimately the screens were taken down, which, you know, was really allows for a nice visual. You can imagine the bugs. You all know the bugs in upstate New York, so it did limit the time that you could spend out there. But I think it does keep with the beauty. And I can tell a fun story about my dad when the work was being done. It was, you know, a longer project than they thought it was going to be. And ultimately at the end, he goes, you know what my favorite part about it being done? And I'm like, what, Dad? And he said, I don't have to listen to Howard Stern all day, every day. So as the workers did their magic, they had to stay entertained. So yeah. So, and of course, Chestwood opened its doors to celebrate the restoration, and the folks had an open house to have folks come in and admire all the great work. So yeah. And I can tell there's people in the crowd talking about the barn parties. Luckily, the majority of the parties happened in the barn, and the best ones were when Harry and Helen were out of town. So I still get in trouble for years afterwards from the notorious parties. Yeah. So that was our years. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carol, for sharing all of these wonderful memories. We do still find darts and beer bottles in the barn regularly.
I bet.
Um, so we'll finish up here quickly so we can get to some questions and memories from all of you. We're so appreciative to the Snyders for their 50 years of preserving Chestwood. Without Caroline outliving John, and without Harry and Helen and the Snyder family, we wouldn't be able to be doing what we are. So our hope is really to carry this forward. This is a picture of us last year receiving an award from the Preservation Foundation for some of the work that we had done. This was one of the first larger projects that we had undertaken that was both structural and cosmetic. We do a lot of the work ourselves here at the house. But we do have the help of some amazing craftspeople, and this was one of those projects. It really was one of the big ones. This ended up being a full chimney deconstruction and reconstruction. You'll see here that when we were doing it, we a lot of these projects start relatively small. It was supposed to start with a third of a deconstruction down to the base of the mansard and then up again, but it really turned into a complete deconstruction and then really re-roofing much of this area. So we used the 1885 photo in order to rebuild this chimney in the style most accurate to the house when it was built. This chimney was not original; it was added sometime after the turn of the century, but we chose to add it back in that original style. We have 5 chimneys in total that are all in need of some work. We're doing a lot of roofing, re-roofing work right now, really re-roofing the base of the mansards, the sprocket, using long-lasting materials like copper. Many of the dormers still have the original, or all of the dormers really still have the original tin roofing. So we're slowly making our way around the house, just like the Snyders did over the last 50 years. That's kind of the name of the game, especially for Second Empires that are so detailed, largely built out of wood. So we've done some other projects, heating, cooling, asbestos abatement, lots of landscaping. We're in it for the long haul, as you can see. Everyone else lived here into their 80s. So we're in year 3 of 50 or 3 of 60, we'll see. In addition to that preservation work, we do spend a lot of time working to preserve the history of the house and some of these artifacts that we know how special it is that we still have them, making sure that these are preserved. Here you see Jenny's portrait, which was restored out in Skaneateles,
And it's
New
actually
York.
very large.
It's very large, yeah. The original architectural drawings, the elevations of the porch, the quarry, the charcoals of some of the family members, including Charles here. And then we really use, try to really bring in tech to make our lives easier so we can focus on this. So this is Klaus. Some of you might know him. He's our robotic mower, our Crest robotic mower, so this technology really has helped it. Technology like this and also technology like Instagram. So that really allows us to share this story with so many of you, to share this with the community. It helps us because we get to learn from so many in the old house community, and many things somehow find their way back to Chestwood because of it too. So that wraps it up here in terms of the presentation component. We'll go into questions, memories. We'd really love to hear some of your memories if you have any of them. Questions that are in the chat, we will, I believe, have Sydney and Sam share those with us. And if you have some memories, anything else you'd like to ask, feel free to raise your hand. We put the instructions here in case you need some help. Sid, we will unmute you so you can speak if you'd like. Just keep an eye out for this notification that will come up on your screen.
Thank you, Marco and Kristi and Carol, both Carols actually, for everything that you've shared, and Carol Godette for help bringing this program to life. I know that there's probably some people that have some memories here on the Zoom, and so if you are willing to share, that'd be great. But I didn't see any questions, which I'm a little surprised by, but maybe that's because Marco and Kristi were so comprehensive that they didn't leave anything left behind to, but I think I had heard about these notorious barn parties from Chris Armour and Doc, and I'm trying to think of who, and so I heard about them long before this. So it's just fun to have everybody bring their stories to life about the history of this building. So if does anybody want to, says also, what was the extent of the work done in 1996? Carol, could you maybe speak to that? Like how much was done? You mentioned that the doors were helped to be restored at one point.
Yeah,
but
the doors were a separate project in the earlier 90s. So both the side door, which was really what we used as our main entrance, there was that stained glass added, and then the front door was more of a cosmetic update. But then in 96, it was the restoration mostly focused on the front porch area and most of the eaves around the house, as well as the painting. So it was again, I guess you could call it a cosmetic restoration. I'm no expert. So but it was I think what started as a painting to have the three different colors turned into much more of a replacement. As you can see, all the work in the I'm looking at the photo, you're not looking at the photo. In the front porch, there's on the top areas, those all needed to be replicated. So I think that was the bulk of the work. I'll let my sisters chime in if they know of more details.
One of the other questions that I saw was how many, is it hard, Kristi and Marco, to find craftsmen to do the work? I think I could say that generally that is a challenge. As somebody who's the chair of the National Preservation Partners Network, the trades is a national issue, that we are losing the craftspeople to do this kind of work. So Marco and Kristi, you want to speak to that?
Yeah. Hi, Diana. I saw your question there.
Diana's looking for craftspeople from Masons up near Batavia. If anyone has any recommendations.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. We've been very lucky thus far with the projects that we've taken. We have wonderful Masons, the Grangers, Chris and Matthew Granger, who we can't say enough good things about. An amazing roofer, Jerry Weaver Roofing. Adam Weaver is just wonderful. I think here in Saratoga Springs we are very lucky to have some craftspeople left. It's probably largely due to the work of the Preservation Foundation and due to the fact that we have so many preserved historical homes here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that the preservation, your local preservation foundation is very helpful. I think we have the benefit too of having, like Marco said, the Great Saratoga Preservation Foundation, but also being near the capital region in Albany. So the Historic Albany Foundation also has a list of contractors. And I think something that we've found interesting is the Adirondack Architectural Heritage group, which is the Preservation Foundation, the Adirondacks. They've been giving very affordable each year workshops on historic plaster and on woodworking that last 2 days.
Window restoration.
Yeah, window restoration. And they basically took the approach of realizing that because the craftspeople are so hard to find, that it is often the homeowners that are learning these skills and helping to keep it going. And we definitely see that on Instagram, as Marco mentioned. There are a lot of people out there who are working on their old houses on their own, just like we are, and trying to do it the right way, trying to save the windows and see all the benefits of using these historic materials too.
Thanks, Kristi and Marco, for the shout out for Adirondack Architectural Heritage, as well as Historic Albany Foundation has a great salvage warehouse, parts warehouse. Former staff of Historic Albany, and as a advisory council member to Arch, I appreciate you recognizing them, as well as our own organization. A couple other questions. One is, how much of the interior is still original? How much has been altered?
So the house is largely original. Because of the floor plans, we can see a lot of what was and what is now. This house was a farmhouse. It is not the Grand Victorian on North Broadway, or a camp, as some of them might have been called on North Broadway. We have original woodwork. We have original crown moldings. So it is largely in original condition. Some walls have been removed, but the exterior envelope and the interior detail remains.
I would say the two main things that have changed is, as we mentioned, Elizabeth Ames, the renovation on the second floor for Upper Chestwood.
Yeah.
That did drastically change the second floor, and we're actually looking to bring it back closer to the original floor plans over time if we can. And then the other thing was, we know from the floor plans that the house originally had 11 bedrooms, which sounds like a very large number, but you have to remember then too that they didn't have bathrooms yet. And so many of them have become bathrooms. So the house really has 4 bedrooms now, 4 to 5, depending on how you look at it.
So when Chestwood was built, it had one water
So some
closet.
good practical developments.
Yeah.
So actually, that makes me wonder, have you come across any documentation of the Slades having any servants living in the house? I mean, that would maybe explain some of those 11 bedrooms. Just curious.
They did, and some of you might know the name Farrington. The Farringtons are a local family. We met up with several generations of the Farringtons.
Thanks to Marianne Fitzgerald, the city historian, I think was the call too.
Yes, Marianne, another great resource.
Yeah. So Joseph Farrington's parents were staff here at the house. Back around the turn of the century. The parents actually met here at the house. And
lived here. It seems like they usually maybe had one maid and one person who worked to help with the farm, from what we've heard and seen. And they do have in the kind of back of the house, and there is the back stairwell. So it seemed like it was a small staff, but when Caroline and John lived here, they did not have that. It was only for the first generation. I think part of it too is just the expense of that as well. But like Marco said too, it was very special to meet the Farringtons and hear that the parents were working as the maid and the farmhand, met here, and then lived here and had their first child here for a few years too. And I think
became very close friends.
Lori Gaylor Thomas, I think, is on the call and helped us find that out too, that they were on the census as living here with their baby.
Yeah.
What an awesome story.
Mhm.
Somebody asked, do you currently live in the home year round?
We do. Yeah, we do. We live here and we work on it at the same time.
Mhm.
It's a
The
work in
house is
progress and
the
it will
house is
forever be.
the house is in remarkable condition, so we can do that.
Mhm.
We can live here and do what we need to do at the same time.
And like Harry said, as Carol shared, it's a lifelong project and there's always more to do to keep it up. Yeah.
Somebody asked about a yearly house tour. I don't know if they were specifically asking about your house or whether or not they were asking about the historic homes tour that the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation does, but I can at least share about that
Share
takes
that.
place every Saturday of the Saturday of Mother's Day weekend every year, and we are fortunate to have people that will open their beautiful homes, private homes and different homes each year. So if you are interested in learning more about that, I think the date, I should know the date, but it's either May 10th or 11th. This year we'll focus again on North Broadway, but I'm certain at some point we will be soliciting Marco and Kristi to share their home in some capacity. So don't worry. That is in the works.
I love the idea of the candlelight home tour that you seem to have in the past too. That's beautiful.
Yes. So
Seemed
many
like it
people
was
love
maybe
that tour.
Christmassy. I think someone mentioned that to us before. Yeah.
We love there's many fond memories of that tour. But maybe we can do a special edition. I don't know if we're going to bring that back, but is Klaus listed as a permanent resident? That's a good question.
He does have a license plate, so he is, he's official.
Yeah.
Question: Are you planting any chestnut trees?
We wish we could.
I
The
don't think they're available.
The American
Right.
chestnut. They've been trying for a long time to revive the American chestnut, but at this point, it doesn't. It's not an option. The American chestnut doesn't get to a mature size.
But there are several books and even a foundation dedicated to just how amazing and influential the American chestnut was on our society, I guess, too. So I hear that if you donate to the American Chestnut Foundation, you get first dibs once they do figure out how to revive it.
I think one other question, and then we'll be wrapping up very shortly. One question was, how do you determine what period you will restore it to? For example, would you ever consider removing the wraparound porch and going back to the original? I guess I will weigh in on that as a preservationist. We often look at buildings and their history as it evolves, and often all of those chapters have significance in their own right. So that's how we would often approach that. However, restoration in the true terms of preservation would be picking a particular time period and then going back to that very specific time period and restoring every aspect of it back to that. But Kristi and Marco, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think we, just like you were saying, Sam, because I know there's a difference between restoration, rehabilitation, and that kind of thing. And we often think of it as more of just trying to preserve what is here and allow it to go another 150 years, hopefully. I think in terms of the porch, I don't think we could ever give the beautiful wraparound porch up, which is probably one of the best, most magical parts of the house. But it's a good question. I'd say in general, we try to when we are making decisions, like Marco said with the chimney project, we do try to, as much as possible, at least see what it would have been originally. And a lot of times it still makes sense to do it that way too. And I think something interesting is that we are not in one of the historic districts. So technically we don't have to follow specific rules, but we really like to and see the benefit in that too.
And we are grateful that you appreciate that. Kay had raised her hand. Kay, I unmuted you. Is there something you would like to share?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm I'm Marco's mom, and I just wanted to say how wonderful this presentation was. I've spent quite many weekends in Chestwood, and I always enjoy very much to be in the environment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Aw, that's sweet. We're glad you shared. Did one last question. Did Elizabeth Ames actually live in the apartment?
So we don't know how often she was here. Elizabeth Ames did end up having a place to retire at Yaddo. Like
This was her original plan.
this was her
She
original
thought she would.
plan. Yeah.
Mhm.
Like John, they both stayed at Yaddo into their late years. John was on the board up until just a few years before his death. I believe it was the year before his death. And the same is true for Elizabeth Ames. So we believe that she did use the apartment at times, but not in the sense of being a permanent residence there. The one house across the street that one of the Snyders actually still lives in, Carol's nephew lives in, was actually built for Elizabeth Ames as well, or built as a garage. Originally, now it's a house. So the three houses that we have here, if you do drive by, the one structure, the older structure from the mid 1830s, and then the structure from the 50s, along with Chestwood, are all very intricately related.
I think we heard too that she almost used the apartment kind of as a weekend home or like a getaway whenever she wanted to do that as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
Wow.
believe she also dated a gentleman who lived in that house.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Leonard Ehrlich, who is
Yeah.
also an author.
Yeah.
Well, I think everybody appreciates, Marco and Kristi, your passion, your commitment, and love for Chestwood, and to be carrying on the beautiful tradition of the Slades and the Snyders. So I'm sure there will be more to this story in the future. And it was certainly a popular program, and we appreciate your time. Again, the Preservation Foundation can't be a resource and help people without support of many of you. And we look forward to seeing more of you going forward. Thank you again, Carol and Carol, for being part of this program and helping it come to fruition. And we hope you have a wonderful evening and a happy holiday.
Thank you for having
Thanks
us.
so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.